make sure, please, when you arrive, to please scan in using the QR code, all right? And before you leave, if you can flip that over, there's an evaluation. And it helps a lot if you can fill out the evaluation at the end. That would be very, very helpful, okay? Today, we are going to be talking about landmark presidential elections, and we have a fine crew of people who are going to be doing the talking. All right, first up will be Samantha Elkins. She will cover the 1800 election, followed by James Hathcock, Dr. James Hathcock, who will cover the 1824 election, Dr. Peter Martinez with the 1896 election, Cynthia Lewis, she loves being called Cynthia, she is doing the 1948 election, and Leigh-Anne Regenold, who will be doing the 1992 election, and we will wrap it up with Vanessa Steinkamp in the 2000 election. So please get your questions ready. We will cover that at the end, and we will, without further ado, wait, no, one more thing. One more thing. In the back of the room, to the left, there's a gentleman named Bob.
Hi, Bob.
Bob has with him two election machines that you can go and try out if you want to. All right, so while we're talking about elections up here, go back there, talk to Bob. He will give you a demonstration. He will explain how this works, and you will be better and more informed voters. If you haven't registered to vote, we have registrars outside who will help you with that. And remember that you only have until October 7th if you want to vote in this coming election to get registered. So let's make sure we do that, all right? Your vote is your voice, and this whole experiment doesn't work without everyone's voices. So without further ado, we're going to start with Samantha Elkins.
All right, so I get the very, very fun early on election of 1800. I thought somebody come back there. We got a slideshow, so you get visuals too. Oh. If you go to the next slide, that'd be perfect. As much as I like seeing myself, I'm good. One more, that's it. All right, so the election of 1800, pretty well-known election. Let's start out in history, and it is going to be Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams. We have our Democratic Republicans, also sometimes known as the Jeffersonian Republicans. I always like calling that because then you know exactly who's in charge of your political party. And you have the Federalists under John Adams. When you're looking at the big issues coming into this election, a lot of the election issues are going around things like the Alien Sedition Acts that have been passed under the Federalist administration, under John Adams. Also, there's issues like taxes, wasn't always taxes, paying for the quasi-war against France, which honestly, France in itself is an election issue in this election, quite frankly. We're going to see that whether it's paying for taxes or whether you're pro-France or pro-British or just anti-France in general, that becomes a really big deal in this election. As well as, quite frankly, when you look at the two political parties, they are very far apart on the political spectrum. Our Federalists are very much more for a centralized government versus our, I'm standing on the wrong side, Federalists, more for the centralized government, whereas the Jeffersonian Republicans, I'm sorry, I'm going to call them that. The Democratic Republicans are more so for less centralized government. On top of that, what makes this election even more dramatic is we get to see behind the scenes and all the internal squabbling of the Federalist Party, because Alexander Hamilton was a big head of the Federalist Party, and he publishes this letter that is just scathing it's not published per se, it's put out there though for the other Federalists to see that he's very against some of Adams' policies regarding whites. And don't put anything into writing unless you want something to put their hands on it. They might do something with it you don't want them to do with it. And that's essentially what happens here, is the Democratic Republicans get their hands on this letter and they publish it for everyone to see. So it's airing out all of that bickering within the Federalist Party, which doesn't really beholden anybody to them quite as much. On top of that, I personally find this to be a really fun election because you get some really crazy mudslinging going on. You thought mudslinging was a big thing today. It's nothing compared to then. For instance, I'm only going to give you 2 examples because, man, I could talk about this for way more if I went to every single topic. But for example, we see Jefferson's side, the Democratic Republicans, they will call Adams' character, they'll say he is without regard to that, I'm going to say this wrong, hermaphroditical character. They basically call him a hermaphrodite, except it's a little bit more complicated. They actually don't call him a hermaphrodite. What they're really saying is he's like a woman. Oh, the horror. But he's like a woman. He's wishy-washy, can't make up his mind, he's not strong, and therefore we should not elect him president. Or, in this case, it's re-elect him president, because he's already been president for the last 4 years. Now, understand the Federalists could throw as much mud as they got thrown on them, because you also see going the other way, my favorite mud-singing campaign, where the Federalists said, don't vote for Jefferson, he's dead. You don't hear that today. I don't think you could get away with that one quite as much today as then. But more things change, more things stay the same. Everybody always knows that's what I say in class all the time. If we could go to the next slide, thank you. So when we actually look at the election, a lot of times electoral maps will look like this for the election of 1800, where it's a very clear, Jefferson gets 73 electoral college and Adams gets 65, therefore Jefferson wins, and done. Except for that's more along the lines of how we have it set up today. The thing is, if you rewind to that time period, electors, they have 2 votes. And these 2 votes, they have to vote for 2 separate people. And whoever gets first place gets the presidency. And whoever gets second place gets the vice presidency. Which is how, in the last election, you get Adams getting the presidency and Jefferson getting the vice presidency. And you can imagine the awkwardness of those 4 years. I want you to picture that today. If the political parties were like that, how much fun that would be. I don't know, fun might not be the right word. If you go to the next slide, this is actually a much better representation of what actually occurred when the electors cast their vote. Just looking at this top table. Basically, what you see here is Jefferson gets 73 electoral college, and Aaron Burr, who is also Democratic Republican, also got 73. So we have a tie in place for first place, which we're going to come back to that. Because who wins when there's a tie? And so this brings us to, I do like to point this out, the Federalists, they were actually prepared for if that happened. And that's why you actually see here, John Adams, he gets 65, but notice Charles Pinckney, he gets 64 because one elector in Rhode Island specifically voted for John Jay so they could make it very clear that, John Adams was who was really running for president and Pinckney would be the choice for vice president. But that doesn't matter because they don't care. So, throwing them out. So we're back to Jefferson versus Aaron Burr. And the question is, who is the president? Well, it gets thrown to the House of Representatives, where it is a 1 state, 1 vote. That's all there is to it. And by the way, at this point in time, there are 16 states electing, trying to decide if it's going to be Jefferson or Burr, and Jefferson always gets 8, which is half, but it's not a majority. The reason this keeps happening is, quite frankly, the Federalists are pretty much in control, to a certain extent, of the House of Representatives. And they see Jefferson as the, capital T-H-E, political enemy. And so they throw a lot of their weight behind, well, we'll just stick it to the Democratic Republicans one last time, and we'll get Aaron Burr to be the next president. Won't that show them? And so you get these votes over and over and over again that Jefferson cannot win. And then who shows up on the scene? But the same guy who disrupted the election to begin with, Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton is not a friend of Jefferson. No means. But he's even less so Aaron Burr. And so he starts this letter campaign that he basically is trying to all the Federalists, you must vote for Jefferson, not Aaron Burr. And it comes down to, if there's one like phrase that you kind of see in place, I would rather have someone with the wrong morals than someone who has none. As addressed. Spoilers. Aaron Burr eventually kills Hamilton in a duel, so we see this set the stage. Let's just look back. And so it is on the 36th ballot that we get Thomas Jefferson actually gets 10 votes. So you just get behind about 10, and he is going to become our next president of the century Joyce. Okay, so why is this an important election? Why talk about it? Well, first of all, we don't want this to happen. Nobody wants to see this, especially if you can imagine in modern day, this scandal. So, this is what causes us to end up ratifying the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. The 12th Amendment of the Constitution, essentially, I could read it, I'm just going to go through it. It's basically, we will see the electors now cast a separate ballot for the president and the vice president, so that it's not going and not come a first place, something like that, and it's very clear who they're voting for to be the president versus the vice president. Furthermore, the reason this is such an important election, I would argue even more importantly, like in that early coming out of the colonial era and everything, is quite frankly, this is the first time we see a change in power. Because the Federalists had been the political power. And now the Democratic Republicans are taking over. And so we see a transfer of political power from one party to another, and yet we do it peacefully. Which means kind of there's hope for democracy to continue on and have these kinds of disagreements that keep the nation going as the and that is the election of 1800. So I'm going to pass it off to the election of 1824.
Can you guys hear me okay? Yes. Okay. What is it?
Remind people that
Okay. Yes. So back here you can, we have the ballot box saved. So you can kind of see if you're, can you check to see if they're registered to vote? Is that right? Yeah, and then outside, if you're not registered to vote, you can register to vote out there in the hallway. So I'll just remind you that. Okay, Karen, if you'll turn the slide for me. Okay. All right, so my job is to talk about the election of 1824. And the first thing I'd like to point out about the election of 1824 is we have 5 very qualified individuals running for the presidency here in 1824. The second thing I would point out about these 5 individuals is they all belong to the same political party. They're all Republicans. Now, Samantha, just before we was talking about John Adams being a Federalist, and by 1824, the Federalist Party is essentially dead. You'd have to take first half of every country to get a full election of that. Until I had 10 minutes, so I'm trying to fight through state. But actually, something called the War of 1812, the Federalist Party really began to slide hard. they're almost gone by the time you get here to 1824. So we have 5 individuals running for the presidency, and they all belong to the same political party. Now, as you'll see as I go through this step by step, they have their own thoughts, their own feelings. There's divisions within the ranks of that Republican Party. But 5 guys who are all Republicans, vying for the top spot in the party. Okay, just real quick to look at these 5 individuals, because I think this helps make sense why the election plays out the way it does. We have a lot of secretaries in this election. People who work for current President Roe at the time. We have the Secretary of the Treasury in Mr. William Crawford. We have the Secretary of State in John Quincy Adams. And we have the Secretary of War here in John C. Calhoun. So again, very qualified government individuals. They've been in government for a while. They know what they're doing. Any one of them could be president of the United States. Now to start with Bill Crawford up here. Like I should have got William Crawford. I'm sorry. Up here in the top left. He comes to us from Georgia, so he's a Southerner. And if I were to try to describe to you his political stance in 1824, I would say that he's an old school Jeffersonian Republican. Now what that means is he stands for small government, limited government, no taxes, sort of a Jeffersonian view here in 1824. So we've got a Southerner, kind of an old political stance of limited government, small, no taxes. Then we have Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, the second guy up here. He comes to us from Massachusetts, so this is a northerner in this campaign. He's the son of John Adams, the guy we saw earlier who was going up against Jefferson in 1800. This is his oldest boy, John Quincy. And John Quincy Adams' politics really are what we would call a new Republican. And for those of you who haven't taken the first half year of history, a new Republican is someone who believes in using the government to help the country grow. They sort of believe in national policies like banks, tariffs, what we call internal improvements like roads and things like that. So this guy's more of an old Jeffersonian, limited small government, and John Quincy Adams is more like we need a big government, a strong, powerful government that can help grow the country and the economy. Over here, the third candidate is Mr. Henry Clay in Kentucky. So here's west. So far we've got the north, the south, and the west, kind of the 3 different distinct areas of the country represented in this guy. And Henry Clay of Kentucky, I can't just call him a new Republican. He is the new Republican ideals. Like he and John Quincy Adams are essentially the same political ideas. And honestly, I always tell my students this, these 2 gentlemen up here on the top right, they should have sat down and had an arm wrestling contest and figure out which one of them was actually going to run for president. So at the end of the day, they're going to take votes away from each other because they essentially stand for the same thing. But Clay, like Adams, believes a strong national government, we need the power of the government to help grow the economy, grow the country, and things like that. Then our 4th contestant for the White House is Andrew Jackson over here. Jackson comes to us from Tennessee, which is, it's west, but it's got a lot of south elements to it as well. Andrew Jackson is our war hero. This guy won a big battle at the end of the War of 1812. It's called the Battle of New Orleans. He's a hero. He's well known across the country. The common people of America really love this guy. He's their champion and their hero. And when Jackson goes out there, he kind of lets you know what his political philosophy is. We got like old Jeffersonian style and just big government and Republican style. And Andrew Jackson's political philosophy is just simply Andrew Jackson. You don't really know where the guy stands. I don't want to call him a flip-flopper, but I don't know. He says one thing in one county, the next day he's in another county, he says something completely different. Kind of his political philosophy was, for God's sakes, you don't have to lie to the American people, but for God's sakes, don't tell them the truth. You don't have to be vague in your answers and things like that. So Jackson's a wild card. He's a loose cannon. Really, all that Jackson's running on more than anything is, hey, I won the Battle of New Orleans. I saved the country, so you should vote for me. So you keep, stuff like that. Our last guy who's trying for the presidency here in 1824 is John C. Calhoun. He comes to us from South Carolina. And John C. Calhoun, Secretary of War, serving under the Roman expressions. He's a complicated man. He's a tortured soul in many ways. He's brilliant. I got to give him that. He's a brilliant man. He really was truly a brilliant man. But he's also about as racist as a human being. A racist and full of hate to his core. Nobody could defend slavery like John C. Calhoun could back in the day. But John C. Calhoun, in this moment, 1824, he's with Clay and them boys. He's a new Republican. in this moment. That'll change very quickly with this election dealt with this stance going forward. Okay, so we've got a list of 5 Republicans. We got Jeffersonian Republicans, we got New Republicans, and we got Andrew Jackson. So Karen, go to the next slide. Okay, about a few weeks before the election was held, the first guy to make a big bold move was our friend John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. That's as technically obvious I get. Calhoun recognized, and this is the quote, he said there's too many ducks on this pond, so there's too many qualified men. And Calhoun knew that he didn't stand a chance here in this campaign. So Calhoun makes the first big bold move, he withdraws his name from consideration. Which is, I don't know, kind of a step back to Calhoun. He never became president. He felt like this might be his one big shot, but he steps aside. But pulls off a very clever political move at the same time. While he withdraws his name from consideration for the presidency, at the same time, he got assurances from John Quincy Adams, that year, and Andrew Jackson. They would support him for the vice presidency of the United States. So he essentially runs the big game for Adams and Jackson at the same time. He gives those assurances there. Calhoun said that it would be one of those two winning. He said it would either be Adams or Jackson who would win this thing, and he called it correctly as he turned second. So our list of 5 became a list of 4 as Calhoun withdraws his name. But he's running as the vice president, support from Adams and Jackson at the same time. All right, so now our list of 5 becomes a list of 4. They're all Republicans. And let's see, Karen, can you go to the next slide? Okay. So 4 candidates for the presidency, and when Americans go out to vote, they did so very differently back then. It wasn't like a day like this in today's world. We have a Super Tuesday. You got to think about America at the time, a lot of farmers. So it's kind of hard for them to come into town and vote, and stuff like that. So actually, this election was held out over weeks, like very late October, all through November, basically 24. People would come in and vote. I don't know that you will ever see a map this colorful in American electoral history. I really don't, because there's so many colors on play here. But at the end of the day, when America votes, Andrew Jackson does come in first. You can see up there the top pie chart is what really matters. With 38% of the electoral vote, he comes in first. He also comes in first with the popular vote. So if I'm going with democracy, if I'm going with the will of the American people, Andrew Jackson clearly is the will of the American people, right? Now, not that table, but someone else in the room. Someone else in the room. What's the problem with that top pie chart? Why do we have problems there? Yeah, go ahead, Emily. Nobody got me going. 10 minutes. To be president of the United States, you have to have 51% of the electoral vote. And though Jackson came in first, he doesn't have 51% of the electoral vote, right? And again, if I step back just for a second, the problem here is Adams and Clay are the same candidate. They're taking votes away from each other. Again, these boys should have arm wrestling if they're running, because it makes this thing a mess. The will of the American people, remember that. The will of the American people is clearly stated that it should be Andrew Jackson. Okay, well at this point what happens when nobody has 51% of the electoral vote, the whole thing does get thrown into Congress, just like 1800, as Samantha talked about, gets thrown into the Congress. This one will get thrown into the Congress as well, and only the top 3 qualifiers would be considered by the Congress for this presidency. So we had a list of 5, right? Calhoun dropped out. So our list of 5 is now going to be a list of 4. That's Henry Clay. If you go to the next slide, Henry Clay is now withdrawn from consideration. So we've only got the 3 left. Now that we go back to the previous slide, Karen, and we'll just stay here. So the Congress can only go with Adams, Jackson, and Crawford. That's the only 3 people who are qualified. The Congress can consider. Now, an interesting fact, though, about Clay in this moment. Even though Clay can't be president, Clay, in this moment, is Speaker of the House of Representatives. He's the guy who stands in front of the House. He's got the big hammer, the gavel thing. He calls them to order and attention and things like that. So Clay, in these moments, became a very popular man because he essentially had a lot of power in deciding who the next president was going to be. And I've often wondered, what if Clay had finished third, but he had worked towards his own presidency, right, to try to stipulate things to get himself into the White House. I think Clay would have said, you know what, it's a conflict of interest. I stepped down. I think he would have done that. But that's what it is. But Clay, he's getting gift baskets. He's getting a lot of visitors. People are checking in to see how he's doing because he's going to have so much to do with the outcome of this campaign. So when America spoke, one more time, Jackson clearly is his candidate, but it turns out Henry Clay is going to have a lot to do with the outcome of this campaign as the Speaker of the House. Guys, when you look at the politics, just could you go back one more, Karen? Sorry. So this guy has to do Republican, right? Big government, powerful government, grow the country, things like that. So his choices are John Quincy Adams, Bill Crawford, and Andrew Jackson. One time, remember this in the back of your head. Democracy spoken and said Jackson. Clay has a lot to do with the way this thing plays out, manipulating votes and things like that. So if you're Henry Clay, you're looking at a guy like Bill Crawford, I would say you really don't have anything for this guy. He's a Jeffersonian Republican, he's old school, he's kind of outdated, he's not going to grow the country a place that you want to do. So he really doesn't have any use for power. It's kind of an X there. If you're Clay and you're looking at a guy like Andrew Jackson, what you would say of Andrew Jackson is this is a wild card. Again, you'd have to take America first. America didn't fully understand the state, but he invaded Florida just because, rigorously all this. He violated chain of commands. And Clay said he should have been arrested and court-martialed for what he did. So Clay, Clay's opinion on this is like, if I need to kill people, Andrew Jackson's my first choice. If I need someone to preside over the country, he might be my last. So Clay has no use for Jackson, who he sees as a wild card, who can't even respect chain of command in the Constitution. So what I'm left with is the guy who essentially is the same candidate for state. John Quincy Adams shares my political values, my political ideas. The new Republican, the growing country. Aaron, if you can go forward one more time. At the end of the day, when the Congress speaks, when Henry Clay speaks, he's going to swing this thing over to John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams is going to win the runoff in the United States Congress. And I've often asked my students this, when you walked in today, did you know that somebody came in first place in the presidential campaign and they were denied the presidency? And that's this election year where Adams came in second, but because of the runoff scenario the way it played, he goes on with the presidency of the United States. So, in looking at this campaign, it's, I think by a mile, I think this is the craziest election the country's ever had. I really do. And I couldn't imagine in today's world, if we had something like this play out, and the thing was going to be decided by Congress, I really think the country would just fall apart in that moment right there. We would just dissolve as a country. If it was up to Congress to decide who the next president was going to be. But in looking at the bigger scheme of things, maybe go forward one more here, sorry, so you can see faces here. So John Quincy Adams goes on to be the next president, to be President-elect Adams. And something that kind of has to make sense here, like John Quincy Adams is going to ask Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State when he becomes President of the United States. In accepting that job as Secretary of State, you've got to understand back then that Secretaries of State tended to be the next presidents. Like Jefferson had been a Secretary of State, he became a president. James Madison had been a Secretary of State, became a president. Monroe, the same story. John Quincy Adams had just finished being Secretary of State, he's about to become president. So taking the job of Secretary of State by Clay, it's not just a job, it's setting himself up for a future presidency, possibly, by taking that job. So it's a big plum position to get. But as word gets out that Adams has asked Clay to be his Secretary of State, there's a feeling amongst the Jackson supporters that first of all he was wrong. There's a lot of indignation there. He feels like this election was stolen from him. I think he's got a valid complaint. Anyways, he feels robbed. But when he finds out that Clay has been asked to be Secretary of State, his supporters begin to talk about there being a corrupt bargain involved in this campaign. And the corrupt bargain works like this. In Jackson's mind, what's happened here is Adams went to Clay and asked, I want your support, I need your help, I want to be the president, name your price. And Clay's response was, my price is you make me your Secretary of State, in return, I'll make you the president of the United States. So it's a bargain, it's corruption at the highest levels, Jackson's mind. And that corrupt bargain thing will stick with Adams, stick with Clay. Clay earns the nickname the Judas of the West, that he sold the people out. He sold America out for Adams' presidency. So that corrupt bargain thing will stick. It'll stick to Clay, it'll stick to John Quincy Adams. And as a result, John Quincy Adams goes on to be a one-term president of the United States. And Andrew Jackson will just devour that man. Politically, character assassinations, mudslinging like you wouldn't believe would go on in the next one in 1828. And what it sets up in in future elections is Jackson goes on to be a two-term president of the United States. But I think another outcome that's really important at the end of this campaign is Andrew Jackson wants nothing to do with any of these people that you see up here on the board. So kind of forgive Calvin later, but he really doesn't want anything to do with these people. So as a result of the outcome of this election, Andrew Jackson in 1825 decided to create something called the Democratic Party, which is still around today, right? Still one of our two political parties that we have now. It's almost 200 years old at this point. So in 1825, Jackson creates the Democratic Party, and we go back to a two-party system thanks to this election of 1824 and the way that it's played out. So yeah, corrupt bargain is a big part of this campaign, but I think just as big as we go back to the two-party system that we've had in play ever since 1824. All right, thank you for your time.
Can you hear me? You can hear me. Oh, I can hear myself. Okay, I am Dr. Peter Martinez, and we are covering the 1896 election, and there are some similarities with this election and some recent elections. So we'll go ahead and start. So next slide. Okay, so the 1896 election will involve William McKinley. Sorry, Julie. Now, yes? Yeah? Okay. Will involve William McKinley and William Jennings Bryan. We'll go ahead and move to the next slide. And before we get to this election, I want to make sure you're aware of these farmers' alliances because this becomes a big deal. Right? When we think about the late 19th century in the United States, a lot of times we think of like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and the Gilded Age, all these rich people and tenements, and big railroad companies, all this stuff, and we forget about the farmers. And the farmers are struggling quite a bit as we go into the 1860s and 70s and 80s as we get to this basically era where we see kind of corporate farms, see these big farms have a lot of money, and these other farms don't have a lot of money. So what winds up happening is they push for legislation in the 1860s and 1870s, what's called the Granger movement. It fails big time by the 1880s, and then what we wind up seeing as we go through the 1870s, 80s, and 90s is the rise of the Farmers Alliance, or Farmers Alliances. There's actually a few of them that kind of merged together. African Americans were also part of this, but they'd be kind of left out in part of this movement too. And you can see that this is a flag from Texas in 1878 when they start this first banner, the Southern Farmers Alliance, as you can see. We'll go ahead and move on to the next page, and we'll come back to some of these issues the Farmers Alliances are fighting for in just a minute or two. Now, one of the things that the farmers were looking for was more money, right? Everybody wants more money. If we have a gold standard, not everybody has access to gold, and it limits the money supplies. So they will basically start working with these states out west that are newly established states that mine a lot of silver. So you look at those western states out there like Nevada, Utah, Montana, you'll see more silver mined out there. The price of silver is dropping down, so what they want is an increase in demand. If there's an increase in demand, then the silver prices rise up, which helps those silver miners, these companies out west and the states themselves. And of course, that gives access to more capital, these farmers and these lower income people across the nation altogether. So in 1890, Benjamin Harrison, the president, signs the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which basically says that the United States government is going to purchase 4.5 million ounces of silver for the purposes of coining it. Now, that will basically greatly increase the silver supply, greatly increase demand, help those silver states out west, and help the farmers who've been pushing for more silver, unlimited silver, is what they're really looking for. So this is a great time for farmers, right? If you have this success, the states out west are doing fantastic, they love this. Senator John Sherman, who drafts this in 1894, is pictured in the image before you. So far things are looking up, not great, but starting to look up. Now, I will say this before we move on to the next slide. One of the problems with silver is sometimes the value of silver exceeds the amount of the silver coin. Now, if the amount of the silver, the value of the silver exceeds the amount of the silver coin, what are you going to do with that silver? You might melt it and then sell the silver. and make more money than what you would have had in the value of the coin itself. So that does become a problem when you start talking about silver, because the value does fluctuate, and if the value is higher than the amount of the coin, then you might as well just melt the silver, and then you actually have more money, right? Which then takes money out of supply, which then screws up the economy. Now, we'll go to the next slide. So by 1892, these Farmers Alliance members meet in Omaha, Nebraska, and they create a political party called the People's Party. You can see on the slide the Omaha platform, right? Free and unlimited coinage of silver and gold, so they want more money out in circulation. Who doesn't, right? Well, that has become a problem in recent years with too much money in circulation. What happens when we have too much money in circulation? All right, so inflation, right? So basically the value goes down, which then creates inflation. So they were looking for free and unlimited quantity of silver. They wanted a graduated income tax. Keep in mind, the United States did not have a federal income tax at this point in time. They wanted a graduated income tax basically so people who make more money pay more in taxes. So strengthening the country that way and not hurting the farmers and lower classes quite as much. They want government ownership of railroads. One of the big problems for farmers, a lot of others back in those days, is that there's really no regulation of railroads. Railroads knew that you needed their services. So if you're going from Nebraska to California, you're not going to do it on foot. There's no cars. You have to take a train. And they knew you had to take a train. So they would charge you whatever they wanted to charge you. And they don't need that many customers if they charge enough, right? Because it's very profitable. So the farmers are really upset about this. And they basically want to get back to the railroad companies and say the government should own the railroad companies. Basically, get rid of them altogether. Next, they want government confiscation of land owned by railroads and corporations too. Bear in mind that when the railroads were built across the country in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, state and federal governments basically just gave millions of acres of land to railroad companies for the purposes of building the railroad and financing the construction of the railroad. And once they're done with the railroads, which doesn't really take that much land, right? It takes a long strip of land, it doesn't take like a broad strip of land. They're basically just to hold on to that land until they can make a lot of money off of it, which means the farmers have to go further to use the railroads, and it also limits the amount of land that they have, which means the price of the land they have to purchase too. So the farmers are looking for that too. So this People's Party is also referred to populism. We're going to move on to the next slide. Now the following year, 1893, we have this severe financial panic. We have a couple of different companies filed bankruptcy, the Philadelphia Railroad Company and the National Portage Company, which had a monopoly on rope and twine production. It's not rope and twine in the late 19th century. And when that happens, we see this collapse of the economy. Unemployment goes up to about 20%. Thousands of banks, businesses fold. Winds up being a terrible time. I think this is probably the second worst depression in U.S. history. Things are just terrible. In 1893, and those people who are against the silver production, silver coinage, pressured the President Grover Cleveland into repealing the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. So that 4.5 million ounces of silver that we're buying each month, that's no more, and now the farmers are really upset. And now the more conservative people, or basically the industrialists, the Gilded Age people, will be pushing for a gold standard to strengthen the economy, while the farmers are looking for more silver. And this will set up this stage in 1896 for this presidential election we're going to get to in just a moment. Go ahead, next slide. As we get in 1896, we have this Democratic Party candidate named William Jennings Bryan. Very religious guy, very Protestant guy, quoting scripture all the time. Gives a famous speech in 1896 referred to as the Cross of Gold speech, which you can see depicted on this slide right here, where he basically compares, he makes this comparison of the cities and the farms by saying if you burn down a city, which just happened in Chicago a few years earlier, if you burn down a city, the city will come back greater than ever, with more people, better buildings, better infrastructure, everything will be improved in a few years compared to what it was before it burned to the ground. If you burn down the farms, everybody starves to death. So he makes this comparison, he draws this allegory to Jesus Christ, and using this gold standard, they're going to crucify the common man on the cross of gold, and really appealing to the senses and spirituality and religious nature of a lot of people in the late 19th century, especially the Protestants. He travels all around the country on train, going thousands of miles looking for votes. He's a great orator, great speaker. He's going to challenge people to, challenge McKinley to debates. McKinley wants no piece of that. McKinley knows that William Jennings Bryan, if talking to the common man, by the way, his nickname is the Great Commoner, if he gets in a conversation with William Jennings Bryan, Bryan is going to make him look bad. So we'll go to the next slide. So instead what William McKinley decides to do is, instead of going all around the country like William Jennings Bryan did, is he says, you know what, I'm just going to go to the front porch of my home, give a scripted speech, take a few questions, and go back inside. And that's what I'm going to do on a daily basis. If you want to see me speak, you come to my house. And the rest of the work is to be done by the rich people who are supporting the gold standard. So all these big newspapers who are owned by rich people are going to start publishing all these articles about how great McKinley is and how dangerous William Jennings Bryan is. In fact, if we go to the next slide, this is from an article I pulled up in 1896. I just pulled this up a few days ago just for fun. And you can see that there's threats of a revolution. William Jennings Bryan is a threat to American democracy. He is talking about socializing the country, taking over the railroad companies, breaking up what we think of as our capitalist nature, and we cannot have him win. So all these big newspapers across the country are going to be supporting William McKinley. McKinley's not going anywhere. He's just speaking from his front porch. William Jennings Bryan is going all over the place. Now, bear with me there. William Jennings Bryan was a supporter of Prohibition, so if you're a drinker, and there were a lot of people drinking in the Northeast especially, they're probably not going to like him that much. But the newspapers are certainly going to be supporting William McKinley, the guy who supports the gold standard. So money really becomes important in this election. That's why we have this election here, is because at this point, money is also very important in elections today. But it really starts right here in 1896. Let's go and move to the next slide. Now, when all is said and done, you'll see this map to the northeast, the red states will go to McKinley, William Jennings Bryan gets the blue states. Those silver states out west go to William Jennings Bryan. Those farmers who live across the south and kind of this Great Plains area, they go to William Jennings Bryan. But the northeast, which is where you can see the biggest cities, the most influence of the newspapers, the most of that money, that's going to generate the support for McKinley. In fact, if we go to one more slide, I think I have one left. I have this one that I just added today, and this is kind of basically a comparison to the map in 2020, and you can see those stars, those yellow stars in each of those maps are the 10 biggest cities in America in 1896 and in 2020. And in 1896, you can see that every single one of the counties, and this is by county, so you can see the counties, that every single one of the 10 cities, 10 largest cities in America, the counties at least where those cities resided, went for McKinley. And if we look at 2020, we can see that each of the 10 largest cities in the 2020 election wound up going to Biden. So what's interesting is you see this reverse, right? But if we look at the election this year, anybody know how much money has been raised? Vanessa, how much money has been raised?
I'll say.
Over $1 billion so far. So I believe Kamala Harris has almost $700 million raised so far. That was after Biden. And I think Trump is a little over $300 million, $330 million. So just imagine billions of dollars they're spending. That's just for the presidential races, not counting Senate and House races. Billions and billions of dollars are spent on these elections year in and year out. And where does it start? 1896. That's all I have. Thank you.
Place so powerful, just.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. As you can see, my name is Cindy Lewis. I'm a history professor here. Before I get into the election of 1948, Bob, everybody look back to Bob, say hi to Bob. As a reminder, Bob has these fancy practice voting machines. So if you've never voted before, this is a great time for you to go get comfortable with doing that. It's your duty and your right and your privilege as an American citizen to do so. So please take advantage of that, all right? Don't make Bob feel bad. Don't waste Bob's time, okay? All right? All right, so slide, please. All right, so I'm talking about the presidential election of 1948. I'll go to the next one. Next slide. So in this election, we have President Harry S. Truman who became president April 12, 1945, with the death of President Roosevelt, who was 82 days into his 4th term in office. And so by 1948, Truman wants to be elected in his own right? He wants to earn the White House for himself. But unfortunately for Truman, he has an uphill battle in this endeavor. He's facing a series of foreign and domestic challenges, and things just aren't looking really promising for Truman in his pursuit of the White House, right? For one, we have the midterm elections of 1946, where Republicans essentially take over Congress, and this Republican-controlled Congress manages to either block or stall most of Truman's initiatives. In addition, their victory in Congress seemed to signal that Americans had moved away from the Democrat Party and away from these New Deal reform efforts. So he's dealing with that. In addition, Truman and the country as a whole are facing economic issues. We have post-war inflation. There's also labor unrest and growing civil rights issues, coupled with, obviously, this is early Cold War, so lots of foreign affairs issues to deal with. So he's really facing an uphill battle here. In fact, things look so dire for Truman that really no other Democrat at the national level believes that he can pull it off. They have so little faith in his fellow Democrats that they try to convince him to drop from the ticket. They try to convince him to drop out of the race. They go on to try to convince General Eisenhower to run for president, or a Supreme Court justice. They try to convince them to run for president. Both of those gentlemen decline politely. And so that leaves Truman seemingly being the only one that had any faith that he could pull off a win in November, right? So nonetheless, Truman does acquire the party's nomination at the Democratic National Convention that was held in Philadelphia in July of 1948. So he's kind of begrudgingly nominated to the presidency, or to be the Democratic nominee. So it's actually during the Democratic National Convention that some pretty serious fissures in the National Democratic Party start to materialize. So just a few days after that convention, there's a group of Southern Democrats that are pretty unhappy, to put that lightly, with the civil rights agenda that had been adopted by the Democrat Party's platform, right? Now these Southern Democrats, they break away, and they form the States' Rights Party, also known as the Dixiecrats, and they form their own political party, breaking away from the mainstream Democratic Party, right? Well, they adopt a policy platform that is openly segregationist, very Jim Crow, pro-Jim Crow. And they nominate this lovely gentleman here, Strom Thurmond, to be their presidential nominee for the upcoming election. So by this point now, we have a pretty solid split in the Democrat Party. And now, while the Dixiecrats broke away from the Democrat Party due to civil rights issues, other Democrats took issue with Truman's Cold War initiatives. These so-called liberal Democrats, they argued that Truman's Cold War policies were arguably too aggressive, too provocative. And remember, we're talking about the early Cold War here, so there's a lot of unease, there's a lot of tension. And a lot of these liberal Democrats felt that Truman was just being a little too hardline on these Cold War issues. So ahead of the 1948 election, many of these Democrats threw their weight behind this gentleman here, former Vice President Henry A. Wallace. He ran on the Progressive Party ticket. So now we have the Democrat Party split three ways, right? Which never looks really good for a Democrat candidate going into a major election. Now on the Republican side, during the Republican National Convention, they adopt a party platform that is very pro-integration of the military. They support an equal rights amendment. They want some tougher Cold War policies, so they're kind of checking a lot of boxes for many voters. And the Republicans nominate New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey as their candidate. Okay. Slide, please. So from the moment of his nomination, it looked like a done deal for Thomas E. Dewey, right? It looked like he was a shoe-in to win this election. And this is largely
Not so much due to his face.
not so much due to his personal popularity, but because obviously of Truman's mixed record on domestic and foreign issues. Plus, we have that very crucial split in the Democratic Party that always tends to benefit the opponent party, right? So everyone pretty much assumed that Dewey was a shoo-in to win this election, right? In fact, by September of 1948, Dewey had a 13-point lead on Truman. And media outlets across the country started publishing articles saying that he had it in the bag, right? The New York Times and Life magazine published a series of articles and headlines saying that Dewey's election was a done deal. And then on election night, the Chicago Daily Tribune posted or published the now infamous headline, Dewey beats Truman, right? They kind of got out of the gate a little too early there, right? But that's how sure everyone was that Dewey was going to win this, right? Everyone except one crucial individual, and that was none other than Harry Truman, right? Next slide, please. So the final votes come in, right? The final votes are tallied, and Truman manages to pull off this very shocking and surprising and pretty solid victory over his contenders, right? And so he pulls in 303 electoral votes to Dewey's 189 and Strom Thurmond's 39. So he pulls out a victory in the Electoral College, shocking everyone, again, except for Truman, right? Next slide. So how does Truman do this? How does Truman pull off what is still arguably one of the most shocking political upsets in the history of the country? Well, to put it short, because we only have 10 minutes up here, he out-campaigned his competition. He was a better politician than his competition. So the moment that he received the nomination, Truman embarked on this cross-country whistle-stop tour. So he hopped on a train and he goes all over the country. During this whistle-stop tour, he stopped in over 250 cities, delivered over 300 speeches, and in each one of these speeches, he was railing against the Republican Party and about conservative policies on things like labor rights and civil rights at a time when those were crucial issues. All the while, he's maintaining support for these New Deal reform efforts and reminding people about how important those still are. So what this does is it manages to allow him to attract and re-energize a lot of these Democrat voters that have maybe been pulled away by the split in the Democrat Party, okay? So he's being very active and aggressive in his campaign. Now, on the other hand, Dewey takes a much more, or much less aggressive, less enthusiastic approach to campaigning. Why? Because he thinks he has it in the bag, right? He thinks he has it in the bag, and so that reflects in his campaign style. So Dewey does a lot of, and I call that from my voice, Dewey does a lot of fewer campaign stops, right? He delivers pretty much lackluster speeches, and on most major issues, he takes a non-deal stance. So he refuses to alienate any voters by taking a hardline stance on anything, right? Well, that does the opposite of what they expected. And instead of him having it in the bag, he's now going up against a very energized Truman. He's whipping up all of this support from a wide array of voter coalitions, right? So farmers, labor unions, Black Americans in the South, right? The women's vote. He is gathering up support where people didn't assume that he would get it. So in doing so, he manages again to pull off one of the most shocking political upsets in American history. All right, so there are a couple things before my voice leaves me completely, and I let you have the next. Two lessons. One is that national politics are fluid, right? There's a lot of fluidity to these national politics, to political parties, and alignments, and things like that. But even more important, what I want you to take with you out of this room is when you're having a bad day, right? When you are facing something that scares you, or when you are racked with self-doubt, excuse me, I want you to be as confident and as self-assured as Harry Truman was on the eve of the 1948 presidential election. Okay, is that a promise? All right, thank you.
Can you hear it? Okay. Yep, you gotta love Truman's confidence, right? So I'm Leigh-Anne Regenold, Assistant Professor of Government, and I'm going to talk about the 1992 election. I think it's an important election to discuss because it's a more modern election, as in I was alive when it happened, as opposed to the other ones where I wasn't. But this is a kind of a key. So I'll set the stage. 1992, the economy is really bad. Bush, 41, right? The first George Herbert Walker Bush. He was basically kind of Reagan 2.0. He's the third Reagan term, right? We're in a third Republican term. He had some of the highest presidential approval ratings in 1991 at the end of the first Gulf War, and he's kind of sailing high, right? He's facing a couple of candidates in his election. Oh, you can hit the side, sorry. Here. So Bush is the incumbent president. He easily gets his party's nomination, no problem. Clinton is the Democratic nominee, and he's a little different, right? He's young, he's from the South, right? He's from Arkansas, and people are somewhat trying to compare him to Kennedy a little bit. But by the time the election starts to roll around, by the time 1992 comes, again, the economy is really bad. I was looking up mortgage interest rates. I bought my first house at that time, and I was like, what? I just remember it was really high. It was like 9 to 10% were the mortgage rates for to buy a house, right? Today, I think they're 6, right? And during COVID, they were like 2, right? And so we'll never see those days ever again. Right, people are like, oh my gosh, the interest rates are high, the inflation's really bad. This is all the same thing. Unemployment was high in 1992, and so Bush is facing a kind of a challenge, right? Do we want 4 more years? Is a term that we often hear. So go ahead and click to the next one. So this is Bill Clinton, right? He's a young, again, where people are comparing him to Kennedy, young, popular, really. He wears Ray-Bans, he plays the saxophone, he goes on late night TV shows, kind of like Jimmy Kimmel's Arsenio Hall. He eats McDonald's, right? I mean, the young people can really kind of get behind Clinton, yes? He's a Rhodes Scholar. Now, he is, at this time, the only president who wasn't a veteran. And that does come up in the election, right? But he'd gone to Yale. Okay, the next slide. This is George, right? Herbert Walker Bush. He's the incumbent president. And his resume is impressive, right? He was the youngest Navy fighter pilot in World War II. He got about 58 combats and into dogfights, and he had several Navy commendations. He was a two-term member of Congress from Texas. He was an ambassador to the United Nations. He was the chair of the Republican National Committee. He was the director of the CIA for 12 years. He was the vice president under Reagan. And then again, he's the sitting incumbent president. So you've got Clinton, who's wearing Ray-Bans and playing the sax. And the young people are like, we kind of like him, right? But you know, when you're young, like how many of y'all knew what like the mortgage rate was? If I'm asking you, right? Young college students, they like him. But are you thinking about the economy really quite yet? And then you've got very, right, kind of old, conservative, Herbert Walker Bush, people like him, but he's kind of not with it. Not that he's like not like Biden not with it, but not like he's just older, right? So here's an example. He goes into a grocery store during the election in 1992, and he's watching a checker scan UPC codes on groceries, right, and putting them in the bags, and he goes, "That is the coolest thing I've ever seen. When did we get those?" 1970 something, this Windows scanner kind of came out, right? So everything he does is kind of, right, reinforcing that he's kind of past the time for the younger generation, right? And so, next slide. So here comes this Texas billionaire, H. Ross Perot. He is the cutest thing. He's got these big ears. He's just adorable. But he also is this brilliant man. He had been a salesman with IBM, and he goes to the board and says, "I think we should get into this software stuff." And they're like, "No, we just want to do hardware. We're just doing the computers. We think that's where the gold is." And so he leaves and breaks off and starts his own company, Electronic Data Systems, which makes him millions of dollars. He also gets involved in politics. He is close with the Republican governor, William P. Clements in Texas, makes him the Texans War on Drugs chair committee. He was, again, a Navy veteran like Bush was. He was famous for trying to get POWs out of Vietnam during the Vietnam War. He also gets a kind of a paramilitary group together of his own employees at EDS that's based here in Dallas to get two of his employees who were jailed in Iran as the Iranian coup is happening, moving from the Shah to the Ayatollah. He is successful in getting them out. So he's got a lot of public support. He goes on the late night talk show, Larry King's show, and he just starts to talk about it's the economy. He's really opposed to NAFTA, and he is talking about how bad NAFTA is. This was being negotiated with Bush and the Congress at the time. Both the Republicans and the Democrats are relatively supportive of NAFTA, and so this is his big issue. He believes that NAFTA, which is free trade, is going to ruin an already struggling American economy by taking jobs away from the Midwest steel belt, right, and which we call the Rust Belt, and all these different kinds of things. And kind of like looking back retrospectively, he's right. NAFTA does hurt a lot of major industrialized states like Michigan and Indiana and Ohio and things where we used to make things, right? It was, quite frankly, really good for Texas, but it wasn't really good for a lot of the Midwest states. And so he comes on and he gets this kind of groundswell of support. He says, people are like, "Well, Ross, you ought to run for president. You ought to run for president." And he said, "Well, I don't know." And he says, "If people get together and get me on the ballot in all 50 states, well, I'll run." And so they do. And so he does. He's running. He gets himself on the stage for the presidential debates. He is early in the election cycle. In polling, he's winning. He beats both the Republican and the Democrats, and so both the Republicans and the Democrats are about to pee their pants. They're like, "Oh my God, what are we going to do? Oh my God, what are we going to do?" So they're both behind the scenes trying to get Perot to drop out and endorse me, drop out and endorse me. Both of them are trying to do that. Well, come summer, Ross Perot decides to drop out of the race. And rumors in the political circles in Dallas said that his daughter's wedding was threatened by the election, and so he drops out. And he says, I believe that the two main candidates, right, Bush and Clinton, have taken a position on NAFTA and free trade and the economy so that the American people can make a decision, right? You can make an informed decision. That was not a big deal, so I'm going to drop out of the race. And so throughout the summer, it's just Bush and Clinton playing the sax and going to the grocery store and being all this wonderful thing. And then at the end of summer, people got really upset. I think it was like September-ish that he decides, oh wait, I'm going to get back in the race. Well now, if you like Ross Perot because he was an outsider, he was a businessman. People believe he's going to go in, he says, I'm going to go in and clean up the government. I'm going to cut spending. I'm out here for the average American, for the little guy, right? These are all the things that Perot is saying. He's getting a whole lot of people really excited who might not have ever been excited before about the election. And so, but he decides to get back in, and now people are like, well, no, that's kind of wishy-washy, right? So, one of the things that kind of helped him was he goes, I just remember watching this newscast and I kept thinking, either he's really lucky or really politically savvy. He's at a rally over in Dallas. He goes out to his Oldsmobile. It's like a Buick. It's kind of nice enough to be a Cadillac, but it's not really a Cadillac, so it's this real, like my grandparents drove an Oldsmobile, right? It's this big old block-long sedan, and he gets in it by himself. Now remember, he's a billionaire in 1992. Like, he's not driving around with some driver, he doesn't have Secret Service or anything like that. He gets into his car by himself, like he's driving himself, and we had keys then, we put the key in, turn the knob, and he turns it, and nothing happens. And then this whole time the camera's rolling on. And he's like, I don't know. He gets out of the car, pops the hood, right? He's wiggling wires. He's like, I don't know. He looks at the camera, and I thought, he is the most lucky sucker I've ever seen, or this is the best stage show on earth. Because all of a sudden people are like, I do that. If my car doesn't start, I pop the hood and I wiggle the batteries, and he's just like me. He gets me, right? And so, next slide. Up comes the election. Ross Perot gets 19% of the popular vote and zero electoral college votes, right? We looked at the election of 48 a few minutes ago where there was another third candidate, right, with Strom Thurmond. He actually gets some electoral votes. Ross Perot doesn't get any electoral votes, but he changes a number of elections, right? I always tell my students we don't have a popular vote. We have 50 state elections. We don't have one national election for president. And so if you look at the states, right, this is just a handful of ones. Look at Texas, right? The difference between the Republicans and the Democrats is 214,000 people, and Ross Perot gets 1.3 million votes. Do you think he had something to do with that? Right? Look at North Carolina. 20,000 vote difference. Right? He gets 357,000 votes. This is the impact and influence of voting for third parties, right? Particularly independent parties. Some of the other ones that we've seen, they were all kind of the same party, right? But Perot is an independent, not Republican, not Democrat, no political experience whatsoever candidate. And he comes in and he shakes things up. Now, okay, next slide. This is, right, the presidential map in 92. Now, Clinton wins. He wins a pretty easy electoral college vote. But remember, if you're looking at how, go back to that one slide, Karen. Look at the difference in California and Texas, the two most populous states. We don't know which way those votes would go, right? political science have been looking at this election since 1992. Right? Go one more. Right? Part of the reason that Clinton gets elected, right? James Carville, who is Bill Clinton's political advisor, famously says it's the economy, stupid. Right? I mean, it does come down to the economy and what's going on. But so while a lot of research suggests that Perot actually took votes away from Bush, right? He drew more votes from Clinton than he did from Bush, which, because the economy's bad, that would have been hard for Bush to overcome, even if Perot wasn't in the election. He would have been running basically on a fourth Republican term. That's really hard to overcome, right? He was older than Clinton, right? Perot and Bush were of the same era, the Great Generation, where Clinton is the first baby boomer to become president, right? And so it really is kind of makes most research that I've seen shows that he probably pulled more votes slightly away from Clinton than he did from Bush, so maybe wouldn't have affected the outcome all that much. But in some of those states that went red, or some of those states that went blue that were really close, it certainly could have been different, right? We also think that Perot brings in a number of voters who might not have otherwise voted, right? And so what election does this sound like to you if it's not 1992? You know, bad economy, want an outsider, you know, those kind of things with no political experience, right? It's kind of this, and even here, right, in 2024, there was RFK Jr., who I heard before Biden got out, asking young students who they wanted to vote for, and they're like, oh, we could totally get a third-party candidate. Go back to one slide, Karen, for a second. And so that's the third-party candidate. That's the independent third-party candidate effect, right? I can almost promise you that one will never get elected. I'm pretty sure I could promise you that one won't get elected. Now, they do affect the outcome, right? So before Biden got out of the race, when it was Biden and Trump, we're like, oh, really? Two old white guys who've both been president, right? People were like, what? Really? I'm not even excited about this election. And then there's RFK Jr. People are getting a little bit energized. He says some things Republicans like. He says some things Democrats like. He does get out as soon as Kamala Harris takes over for Biden, and because he realizes that he might draw more votes away from, I guess, his preferred candidate, right? Trump. Trump. But that's it.
Hi, my name is Vanessa Steinkamp. I'll be talking about election 2000. I will make this quick, because what I've learned is all guys like to talk a lot. And so I am going fast. So election 2000 was about what state? What state did election 2000 hinge upon? Florida. This table knows. Florida, right? It hinged on Florida. Does anybody want to guess how many million people voted in Florida in election 2000? Throw out some numbers. Oh my God, Peter is a ringer. He's up here telling me all the answers. It hinged on, Karen, I told you not to record. It hinged on 6 million votes casted, 537 votes. There were two candidates. The Republican Party candidate was George W. Bush, and the Democratic candidate was Al Gore. And on election night, November 7th, I remember this like it was yesterday. I was teaching government, so it was my job to be meticulously watching the election. At 10 minutes, you guys know Florida's in 2 time zones. Who knows Florida's in 2 time zones? You've got the Eastern time zone for most of the state, and the Panhandle's in Central time zone. Is Panhandle red or blue? Thank you, Peter. Peter, would you just like to come up here and do this with me? Yes, it is more Republican. 10 minutes before the polls close in the Central time zone, the media calls the state of Florida for Al Gore. Now, I'm not saying it had an effect, but back in 2000, we didn't have early voting, and so a lot of people might have been voting those last 10 minutes of the election. So all the major news networks calls the state of Florida for Gore,
And then a couple hours later, and they base that decision on exit polls. Well, one thing we know about exit polls is you ask people as they come out of the polls, who do you think they're voting for? There was a lot of pressure on pollsters that night to call the state early. Most of the statisticians working for the major news networks, and I know this because I had a professor at UVA that was consulting for NBC that night, was saying, we are within the margin of error. Let us not call the state, but the media wanted to scoop the story, so they called the state. And 2 hours later, they suddenly see Bush gaining massive momentum. So they surreptitiously move him out of Gore's category into the undecided category, which is kind of a big deal. At that point, I go to bed. I wake up a couple hours later, turn on the TV, and realize that at about 2:15 a.m., the networks now call the state for Bush and declare him the president-elect. Yes? Okay? Al Gore is going to give a concession speech in Nashville. He's already called Bush and conceded. And about 45 minutes later, his aides call him and they're like, holy cow, the lead has dwindled. It's now within thousands. He calls Bush to rescind his concession. And Bush is like, let me make sure I understand. You're calling me to rescind your concession and retract it? And Al Gore is like, yes, the election continues. By the way, to make the story a little bit more interesting, it just so happened that Bush's brother, Jeb Bush, John Ellis Bush, is the governor of Florida. So he's like, well, my little brother tells me I'm going to win this. And Gore is like, I'm sorry to tell you, he's not the arbiter of the election. So he now gives a concession speech. By 4:15 a.m., the networks move Florida back into the undecided category. The vote total is 527 votes, which falls within the margin of error and triggers an automatic recount. When they do the recount, his lead is now 327 votes. This is a very close election out of 6 million voters. Gore wants a manual recount of the votes casted in the democratically heavy counties. Now, this brings up a few buzzwords that you've probably never heard of. A butterfly ballot and a chat. If you could, Cynthia, just click the slides through superfluous ones to the, keep going. It's a little blurry, so I apologize. It is a butterfly ballot that they use in Florida. I have actually voted via butterfly ballot in Cook County, Chicago. You stuck this thing in there, and you were given a metal kind of stylus, and you were to poke out a little perforated thing called a chad, all right? Now, if you look at this, is this kind of confusing? And if you didn't stick your paper in correctly, you could have actually voted for the wrong person. Does this make sense? Yes? Not only did you have to know who you were voting for, you had to line it up perfectly, take your metal stylus, and perfectly, pristinely push out the chad. Yes? Well, how many people do you think were awesome at this? How many of you think people were terrible at this? They had overvotes where people were voting for 2 presidential candidates, clearly showing they had no idea how to use this. And they had undervotes where people weren't voting for any presidential candidate. So if you go to the next slide, the manual recount triggered them to try to figure out the intent of the voter. That Halloween was amazing. We had so many people dressed up as chads. So you have, for the undervotes, they're manually recounting. They have things called a pregnant chad. A pregnant chad where it looked like they dipped the stylus in, but it didn't poke anything in. They have a dangling chad. They have a hanging chad, a swinging chad, a tri-chad where all 3 counters are attached, but one is not. And when you're doing the manual recount, you have to touch the ballots, which is doing what to the chads? What is it doing to these perforated chads if you're touching the ballots? Yes, it's tearing them, right? It's making them all become dangling or hanging chads, right? So and by the way, the people counting the ballots, are they political? Are they partisans? Are people counting the, Is everybody partisan today? Everybody got some affiliation either way? They are partisan. There are reports, so many rumors are surfacing. People are eating chads. So they're taking the evidence. And so, Florida has to finish recounting these ballots. There is something called the Brooks Brothers riots. Do you guys even know what Brooks Brothers is? I'm really aging myself here. Brooks Brothers is like a store where you go to get your suits and stuff. Something called the Brooks Brothers riots, I believe on November 13th, where they riot outside the Miami-Dade office where they're counting the ballots to say, this is madness. We just need to stop this. Next day, Miami-Dade is like, fine, we're stopping this. This is mayhem. Democrats accuse the Republicans of kind of threatening those people. It goes on and on. Gore is suing to keep the manual recount going. Bush is suing to certify the votes. They get the Supreme Court involved. And it is absolute madness trying to count these chads and these ballots. And everybody's touching them. They're shipping these to Tallahassee. They're getting more and more. The chads are loosening. So finally, on December 12th, the Supreme Court issues 2 decisions. 7-2, the way the recount was going violated the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause because there was no universal standard. I mean, how are you going to figure out the intent of a voter from a pregnant chad, right? And then the more controversial decision was the 5-4 decision that deemed that the recount could not continue. There is a federal law that says all states must certify their electoral votes 6 days before the Electoral College meets in December. Well, the 6th day was going to be the next day. They said there's no way this is going to happen in time. Florida needs to certify their votes. That decision hands Bush the election. And there were a series of changes that came as a result. 1, the media promised to never call a state again until the polls close. Although I would like to add, this past year in Iowa, when the Republican Party had their caucus, it started at 7. At 7:01, phones started lighting up saying Donald Trump had won the Iowa caucus. They had not even started, really. 2, they passed the Help America Vote Act, which is why we now have these fancy machines that I wish you guys would have tried in the back, because you will not be subject to the punch card ballots or the chads. They also made sure that they would have disability access for voting machines, and they tried to make it more equitable. The 2000 election changed a lot of things, I think, in regards to revamping our ballot system and our voting machines, and we now get to vote via computers, and I don't ever have to see a chat at the ballot box again. Thank you.